Sometimes the things we believe will free us actually imprison us. Sometimes the escape hatch is more like a trap door. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the weekly message for The Table, a church in Davenport, Iowa, where people are moving from greed toward generosity, from violence toward peacemaking, from isolation toward neighborliness, and from fear toward faith. I'm Pastor Rob Leverage, and our scripture today is from the Gospel of Luke. It's a miracle story that takes place in a synagogue on the Sabbath day, and you could say it has real relevance to a whole variety of contemporary concerns. So let's open our hearts and give a good listen. Now he was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, but not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Fiona Hill is a diplomat and a U.S. intelligence officer, or former U.S. intelligence officer, who focused on Russia and Ukraine. She is an expert. She has been on a lot of news shows since the war began and has talked about a variety of things, but she's told one story of attending a very fancy state dinner, a very regal affair, right? There's people there from many, many nations, and she was seated next to Vladimir Putin at the same dinner table. And a captivating detail that she observed was that Vladimir Putin, this was a few years ago, but at that time, Putin went this entire evening without eating or drinking anything. Plates were set before him. 20 minutes later, they were taken away untouched. Several courses, he never even took a sip of water. Her conclusion was that he's afraid of being poisoned. Yeah. Now, security measures at this event were already extreme. Of course, world leaders always have to take very significant precautions to remain safe. That's just the world we live in. But apparently, Putin takes things to a different level. And we note this understanding that Putin himself has ordered the assassination of many journalists, including many by poisoning. He's done assassinations of political rivals and really, all sorts of people who could be critical of his rule and his way of doing things in Russia. So if he is afraid of being poisoned, he's afraid of someone doing to him what he has done to so many people, right? Now, when a dictator uses brutal tactics to achieve his goals, he probably sees this violence as a solution to a problem, right? I've got this person causing difficulty. I'm going to eliminate them. Problem solved, right? And so hurting or killing somebody who is opposed to you is a way that a dictator can remain free to do what he wants to do. Right? That's the theory, but Putin has created a situation in which he feels unable to take even a sip of water in the presence of other people for fear that his own tactics will be used against him. Okay. Sometimes the things that we do to free ourselves actually imprison us. I think of so many addiction stories. And addiction stories vary from person to person. So you can't say one thing that applies to everybody. But there is a certain theme that shows up in many people's experience, where there is some terrible thing that a person is trying to escape, right? It could be grief. It could be trauma. It could be physical pain from some injury. It could be social anxiety or even self-loathing. But a person has got something really, really bad, really hard going on with them, and it just feels so difficult. It feels too painful for them to deal with it. So the person drinks or uses as a way to escape from this scary, painful thing, right? And again, this is not everybody's story of addiction, but it is common, right? You've probably heard some version or maybe many versions of this story. And something that people in this situation often discover is that alcohol or drugs, despite being used as a method of escape, they actually become a prison, right? It's true. A person is trying to get free of their pain, but they get locked up in a chemical dependency, which creates all kinds of new pain. Yeah, because sometimes the things that we believe will free us actually imprison us. Money can function this way too. Money's maybe a little bit more dynamic than some other things, because money can truly improve a person's life and increase their real happiness dramatically. If you go from not having enough money to eat and stay warm, or to give the basic life necessities to your family, right? If you don't have enough food on the table, and then you get a little bit more money so that you now do have enough food on the table and you're not worried about being evicted and being out on the street, then in that situation, a little bit more money actually increases people's sense of stability and happiness, and they just feel okay in a way that they didn't before. But people have studied this for a long, long time, and it's really true. It's really easy to see in the world that above a certain level of income, a very modest level of income, more money does not make people happier. And in some cases, actually, people are less happy with more money, as shocking as that is for people to consider. If, say, people start to consume more things and they have more bills and there's more pressure to pay for all of this stuff that they have signed up for, right? It's strange to think that somebody could look back and say that when they had less money, they had less money trouble, right? But that this is a thing. This is a real thing, because sometimes the things that we believe will free us, right? If I can just get a little bit more of this, then I won't have all of the stress and all of the worry that I have, right? I can be free. And yet we feel ourselves chained and bound and imprisoned in ways we didn't even before. Okay? Now, in today's scripture, Jesus performs a miracle for a person that he sees while he is teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, this is a healing miracle, right? The woman has a kind of back pain, a back problem, and it says that she has not been able to stand up straight for 18 years. Whew. And he does heal her, right? It's a healing. But in this story, Jesus, for his part, does not use the language of healing. I don't know if you noticed that when I read it. But he does not call this help that he gives her a healing. Instead, he talks about being set free. And he says that he uses that language multiple times in this fairly short episode. Okay? Because this woman had been bound. She had been imprisoned by her affliction, and Jesus' gift to her was to release her. She was not going to be held captive anymore. Okay? That is what Jesus did for her in this story. Okay? And this language of bondage and freedom, it rings true, because, I don't know if you've ever dealt with like a long-term health problem or a long-term injury. If your body is not well over a long period of time, you don't just feel sick. You don't just feel injured, although obviously you do feel those things, but you just feel caught. You feel trapped. You feel chained, right? And you want to be free of this thing. Okay? When I think of the woman in this story, I wonder, 18 years, I mean, God, like what might she have tried over that long span of time? Or what would she have been willing to try in order to get free of her affliction if she had the opportunity? Like if this person was living in our time, would her story have simply become part of the opioid epidemic? I mean, that's an obvious question that comes to mind. During those long years, was she in danger of becoming imprisoned, right, by something else as she sought freedom from her ailment? This is a real, this is a fundamental concern of the human condition. When Jesus touched her, she was finally freed. She was truly freed. And I say finally because it is finally at long last. Something that we should be mindful of when we read the Bible is that so many of the people that Jesus healed in the Gospels, they had been suffering for years and years and years. And in many cases, we are told explicitly they've been dealing with some kind of horrific condition for their entire lives. The miracle creates a new beginning. And this person in this story, with this new beginning, she immediately starts praising God, right? And it's a beautiful, it brings tears to your eyes, right? But we should also note that this woman was not spared hardship, right? And so many of the people that Jesus heals in other stories, these are not stories in which people are just, hey, you don't have to deal with a difficult life, because they've been dealing with a difficult life for decades, for their whole lives, year after year after year, without relief, right? Life has been very, very, very difficult, okay? And sometimes, even in the scriptures, the healing never comes, even amongst people who are deeply devoted, people who are praying, without ceasing, right? People who have true and profound levels of faith. Okay? So in the scriptures, most famously, the example would be the Apostle Paul, who had some kind of physical affliction, and he asked the Lord to free him from it. I believe his wording is that he prayed to be delivered, right? And it didn't happen. He prayed again, he prayed again. It didn't happen. God did not take away his physical condition that he prayed for freedom from. Okay? Now, Paul still did believe that God was freeing him, and that actually God, like this physical condition that he was dealing with, and we don't actually know what that was, what his diagnosis would be if he had gone to a modern medical doctor. But he believed that affliction it actually played an important part in the work that God was doing in his life. And we want to be careful in the way we articulate that, because you never want to go up to somebody who's suffering and being like, well, this is actually a good thing because of some hidden reason or something like that. But for Paul, he did believe that his suffering, though it stayed with him, though it had a meaningful part to play in his life, even though he didn't fully understand that, and that even though he wasn't free of this physical condition, that God was freeing him and giving him strength in the midst of hardship to live by grace and to live with courage. Okay? And that reliance on grace is necessary for anybody who's waiting on a miracle. Okay? Because you don't know if the miracle is coming or what form it might take. Right? You don't know if you're this person who's had a back problem for 18 years and one day it's going to be miraculously taken away, or if you're going to be more like the Apostle Paul. You have a role to play in God's transformation of the world. And this thing that is really causing pain and difficulty in your life is going to stay with you. Like, you don't know, but we could imagine talking to the woman in this story, right? This person who did eventually get delivered, right? She did get freed of her physical affliction, right? But imagine somebody talking to her after she'd been suffering for 10 years. Okay, and trying to encourage her under those circumstances to believe that one day her back would be healed. Hey, just don't give up, just hold on. Like, one of these days, this huge debilitating back problem is just going to be taken away. Trust me, you just got to believe, right? And she had already been suffering for 10 years, right? I'm sure to a person in that circumstance, like, it would be nice to say, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm just holding out. One of these days, this back problem is going to be taken away. But there's, that there's also that voice in their mind that's being like, yeah, sure, it's going to be taken away. It's been 10 years. And so we know that this individual person must have found a way to accept what was happening to her physically, to live with it, even if she wasn't at peace with it, right? She was never going to have been happy to be dealing with this terrible condition, right? But she was committed to carry on, right? People with disabilities are often the strongest people you will meet because of the challenges that they live with, right? And there are people who have physical limitations that have a strength of will that is truly impressive. This is a fact, and it has always been the case. Now, we don't know this woman's whole, 360-degree approach to life, but we know that part of how she lived with her condition was her faith practice, right? She went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. She prayed the prayers. She listened to the scriptures. She heard the ancient stories of God's covenant with God's people. And that's why she was there the day that Jesus saw her in the crowd, right? It was the Lord's day, and she was a church lady. You go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, right? And this is where the story, of course, becomes supremely ironic, because when she is healed amidst a congregation of people who are gathered for the purpose of expressing their faith, the faith leaders get mad when she's healed. It's the Sabbath day. A healing miracle is work. You're not supposed to do work on a Sabbath, right? The leader of the synagogue even says, guys, there's 6 days for working. There's 6 perfectly good days for working, right? Healings should happen on those days and not on the Sabbath day, okay? Jesus is pretty frustrated by this reaction. He calls the guy a hypocrite on the spot. But the hypocrisy that Jesus points out, it is not about rule following, because the Sabbath is not actually about work. The Sabbath is about freedom. So Jesus does not say, you hypocrites, you know that you work on the Sabbath sometimes too, right? No. He says, if you have an animal that is tied up, it is bound. You untie your donkey or your ox on the Sabbath. You release it, don't you? You untie it, you set it free so that it can get a drink. Of course you do that. It needs water. Okay? It needs to be freed so that it can live. Yes. If a person needs to be freed, you free the person. Okay? And in fact, if it's a person, the Sabbath day is the best time for it, because this Sabbath is the Lord's day, and the Lord sets people free. God set our Hebrew ancestors free from bondage in Egypt. Jesus spoke the words of the prophet Isaiah, saying that he was anointed to let the captives go free and set at liberty those who were oppressed. And the Sabbath day itself sets people free from back-breaking toil at the end of the week, every week. Okay? Rest, sacred rest, divinely ordained rest is freedom. Okay? The Sabbath is meant for freedom. But the religious leader in this story has actually allowed the thing that was supposed to be freedom to become a prison. Yeah. Yeah. Sabbath is about everything that you can't do, everything that is not possible under his frame of mind. Faith, friends, is meant to liberate us. Okay? It is for freedom. But very often religion does not feel like freedom, does it? Very often religion feels more like bondage. The thing that is meant to free us is treated like a cage. And so the leader of this synagogue would rather this woman not be healed than be healed on the wrong day, right? Some religious leaders in our time, right, would rather people not get married than to marry the wrong gender, or they would rather we reject science if it doesn't align with a literal reading of the Bible. It's a cage, right? It makes religion into a cage or a trap. So often, religious conversations focus on what we can't think, right? Or are not supposed to do, rather than helping us to see everything that God is making possible, right? Because God is doing beautiful, transformative work all the time. See, setting people free from violence, from greed, from sickness, from fear, right? It's God's gift of freedom, not God's power to control, that makes God worthy of our praise. Yeah. So as we see it, as we see Jesus setting people free, free to live, free to love, free to serve, free to thrive. Friends, let's not try and lock them back up. Amen.